All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're going to unpack one of the most complex and honestly, one of the most important stories in Canadian history. We're looking at the deep, tangled connection between treaties, the residential school system, and this ongoing journey toward reconciliation. It's really a story of promises made, promises shattered, and the incredibly difficult work of trying to heal.
So, first things first, what exactly is a treaty? It is so important to understand that these are not just some dusty old documents sitting in an archive. No, they are living, breathing agreements. They actually define the rights and obligations for everyone, and they form the very foundation of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. And that leads us to this really powerful idea. We are all treaty people. This is way more than just a slogan. It's a fundamental truth. It means that these agreements aren't just about Indigenous peoples, not at all. They involve shared rights and responsibilities for every single person living on this land we now call Canada.
To really wrap our heads around this, we have to go back, way back. You see, the first treaties weren't about one group surrendering to another. They were negotiated between the British Crown and independent, self-governing First Nations. Think about that. These were agreements between nations. And what's wild is the timeline here. This isn't just recent history. It has incredibly deep legal roots. It all starts back in 1763 with the Royal Proclamation, which basically said, yes, Indigenous peoples occupy this land. Just a year later, the Treaty of Fort Niagara cements these peaceful alliances. Now jump forward almost 220 years to 1982, and you see those very rights protected in Canada's own constitution. It's a long, unbroken legal tradition. But here's the rub. This is the crucial point where things start to go wrong. Both sides came to the table with completely different ideas. First Nations were looking for coexistence, mutual respect, sharing the land. The Crown, it was focused on something else entirely, clearing the land for settlers and getting access to resources. This fundamental disconnect is really at the heart of so much of the conflict that came later. And this disconnect leads us to a dark and profound breach of that treaty relationship. Colonial policies, which were designed specifically to assimilate and control, went directly against that spirit of partnership. And the most devastating tool of this policy? The residential school system. And you can just see the clash right here. It's so stark. On one hand, the treaties promised partnership, mutual benefit, peaceful relations. And on the other hand, the residential schools were created for the exact opposite, to isolate children, force them to become like Euro-Canadians, and try to completely erase their identities. There's just no way to soften this. This quote from historian John S. Milloy lays it bare. The goal of the entire system, sanctioned by the state, was, in their words, to kill the Indian in the child. It wasn't about education. It was about cultural eradication. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC, actually gave a name to this process: cultural genocide. And what that means is the deliberate destruction of the structures and the practices that allow a group of people to survive as a distinct group. This is the framework the TRC concluded was necessary to understand the true impact of the schools. The scale of this system was just staggering, and its legacy, its real legacy, is a human one. It's measured in stolen generations and a kind of trauma that still echoes today. Over the course of more than 160 years, it's estimated that around 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their homes and forced into these schools. Just let that number sink in. 150,000 children. And the TRC has documented over 4,100 deaths, but its chair, Justice Murray Sinclair, said the real number is likely over 6,000. These are children who died at the schools, often from diseases like tuberculosis that ran rampant because of neglect and horrible conditions. And they were often buried in unmarked graves. Their families never even told what happened. And if you're thinking this all happened a long, long time ago, think again. The very last federally funded residential school closed its doors in 1997. 1997. That is well within the lifetime of so many of us. This is not ancient history. And the harm, it didn't just stop when the schools closed. The legacy is this: deep, deep intergenerational trauma. It shows up as lost languages and cultures, higher rates of illness and PTSD, and families and entire communities just torn apart. These aren't just bullet points on a slide. They are the lived realities for survivors and their children and their grandchildren today. So,
With all this pain and secrecy, how did the truth finally start to come out? Well, it was a long, slow process of acknowledgement, and it began with the very institutions that ran the schools in the first place. This timeline really shows you just how long it took. It started back in 1986 with the United Church. But it wasn't until 22 years after that, in 2008, that the Canadian government itself issued a formal apology. And then, all the way in 2022, Pope Francis came to Canada to apologize for the Catholic Church's role. Now, a massive step in all this was the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Its job wasn't just to write a history report. Its mandate was to bear witness, to actually listen to the stories of thousands of survivors and create a permanent historical record, so this history could never, ever be forgotten or denied again.
But the TRC's work wasn't only about looking backwards. It was about trying to figure out a path forward. Its final report laid out 94 concrete recommendations, a blueprint, really, for what reconciliation could actually look like in Canada. And this is what came out of all that work, the TRC's final report. It's so much more than a summary of what they found. It's a comprehensive and, frankly, a challenging blueprint that calls for some really fundamental changes in the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. So what do these calls cover? Well, as you can see, they touch on pretty much every part of society. We're talking about reforming child welfare, decolonizing our education and healthcare systems, fixing injustices in the legal system, and breathing new life into Indigenous languages and cultures. It's a truly holistic approach to healing. Which brings us to today, and to the ongoing day-in, day-out task of rebuilding that broken relationship. This is the active, present-day work of reconciliation. And here's something really important. We have proof that a better way actually works. The contrast here is just night and day. The old historic treaties, they often led to dependence and poverty. But the modern treaties, the ones negotiated since 1975, they're done in a spirit that's much closer to that original idea of partnership. And the results? Communities with modern treaties see their well-being improve at nearly twice the rate. It works. So when we talk about reconciliation, what do we mean? Well, it's not a one-time thing. It's not just an apology. The TRC defines it as an ongoing process. It's the daily work of building and, just as critically, maintaining a mutually respectful relationship. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And that leaves us with this final, really crucial question. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission gave all of us a roadmap with its 94 calls to action. So the question for every single one of us, as treaty people, is this. What does walking that path actually mean for us in our own lives and our own communities right now?